Hello, dear friends of Zeitgeist, the blog and podcast that brings you all the German history you could ever want and maybe even some you don't want. I'm your host, Katja Heuer, a German British historian and journalist, and I'm joined today by fellow Anglo German, though I'm told she doesn't like the term, and best-selling author Andrea Wulf. Welcome, Andrea.
Hi.
Is it true what I've heard? Do you really not like being described as an Anglo-German? To me, you seem to be the archetype, really. You were born in India to German parents, then raised in Germany, and you've lived in London for a long time. In fact, we're recording this in your London abode, and here we are, two Germans speaking in English. Doesn't that qualify you as an Anglo-German?
I suppose I can't remember that when he said I hate it. I think in general I have problems being put in a kind of country box. I suppose I've always felt very European, I've suffered a lot through Brexit. It pains me so much. So I'd rather be a European historian than an Anglo-German one. But you're right. I have German roots. I have a German passport, but I've lived here for almost 30 years. So, and I write in English. So, yes.
You sort of tick some of the boxes, but you don't like boxes.
We are two German historians who speak English. Yes.
Excellent. Well, that gets us, not being able to fit into boxes, gets us nicely into your latest book, Magnificent Rebels, The First Romantics and the Invention of the Self. Can you tell us a little bit about the book? What is it about?
Well, it's a book about a group of thinkers, poets, philosophers, scientists, writers who came together in a small German town, which very few people outside Germany have ever heard of, called Jena, which is about 150 miles southwest of Berlin, at the end of the 18th century. And they kind of really changed the way we think about us and the world and nature. And a lot of the names are not that famous here in England, but these are all the names, you probably agree, we Germans kind of grew up with. Someone like Goethe and Schiller and Hölderlin and Novalis. So, and it turns out they all lived in one town together at the same time. So I became very curious to find out why, because there are these kind of strange moments, I think, in history, which kind of magnify certain moments or issues when a group of like-minded people come together and really change something. The Bloomsbury set, or the modernists in Paris, or the American transcendentalists. And I think the group that came together in Jena is intellectually probably the most important one of all these groups.
Yeah, and some of that magic I feel still lingers in Jena. I've got a huge soft spot for the city because I studied history there at the Friedrich Schiller University, and I just loved being in that space for 6 years because it does still have that intellectualism and just the sort of bit of a sparkle about it today. It's quite something really to wander the streets of Jena, that some of those really famous philosophers, thinkers, writers once frequented. How did you stumble across the place, and did you also get, a chance to spend some time there?
Yeah, so I kind of stumbled into this story when I was doing my research about Alexander von Humboldt from my previous book, The Invention of Nature. And so Humboldt had spent quite a lot of time in Jena in the 1790s, just before he goes off on his South American expedition, and he kind of hangs out with Goethe and Schiller. So I was doing research there, and as I was walking the streets of Jena, just like here, you have name plaques, and literally around every corner there was another really huge kind of literary name on a house, and I was like, what is going on here? So I kind of kept it in the back of my mind. And in a way, I should have written the books the other way around. Chronologically, Magnificent Rebels should have been before Invention of Nature, but that's just not how this works. So that's how I started. And then as I was doing my Humboldt research, on the side, I would, whenever I was like in the right archive, I kind of, just check if the other names kind of are there and what do I find there. So it started like this, but then I wasn't quite sure. Did I just want to write a book about just a group of thinkers? Because all my books, what I try to do is I don't write something just because it happened in the past. I'm always interested in what does that tell us today. So I need to have an angle that enlightens us today. So with Humboldt, it was really about the relationship between humankind and nature, and why have we destroyed so much of our planet? And it took me quite a while to work out what Magnificent Rebels was about, and because I wanted, in the end, I realized what I want to know is like, why have we become such a selfish species? And it turns out that that particular moment in time at the end of the 18th century in Jena was really the beginning of the modern self. So the idea of free will, but also the balancing act between selfishness and the breathtaking possibilities of a self-determined life kind of is one of those magnified moments there and then. And so then I knew this is the kind of book I want to write. So because you have like all these different ideas, and most of them end in a dead end road. But so this one became really this search for, when did we become such a selfish species? When did we first believe or expect that we have the right to determine our own lives? And how, when did we first ask questions such as, how can I be free? So that's really that was the beginning. I mean, it was not one moment. It kind of took a long time until I kind of worked that out, and that kind of became Magnificent Rebels then.
It seems to me that, there's this massive connection, obviously, to the way that we live today, but also to you personally. It seems to me that there was a really, strong connection between you and those rebels as well, because you describe in the introduction that your own life choices have been very unconventional in lots of ways. You say that you want to study, for example, and learn and think, but traditional academia turned out pretty quickly wasn't quite what that was, basically, what aligned with this wish. And you say you fell in and out of love easily. Your daughter was born at when you were a comparatively young age. And all of these things are kind of themes that reoccur in the book as well, which kind of made me think, were you drawn to the Jena set because you would have quite liked to be one of them?
Well, it's funny because there's one very strong-willed single mother in this book, and a lot of people say to me, "Oh, did you identify with Karolina Schlegel?" I'm like, it didn't really ever occur to me until I started doing publicity and people asked me. I was definitely drawn to them because they were rebellious. It's always, it's much more fun to write about people who are, fighting the establishment than to write about the establishment, I think, personally. I don't think it has to be reflected in your own life, but I suppose, so as a female historian, I also always get asked, why do you always write about men? And it's like, well, it's not like by choice. It's just, I find the person I find interesting, and a lot of the times it happens to be a man, because letters were kept more about men than women. But it was so much fun to have a couple of strong female protagonists in that book, which is it's different, and you realize also how the men might have been rebellious, but the women, for them it was like a much bigger step to do what they did. And this is on the one hand, this is a book about kind of big ideas, but it's also a bit of a soap opera. Because you always need something light to kind of balance out all that philosophy, I think. Otherwise, it would have been a really dull book. So you have scandals and love affairs and changing lovers, and these women were just extraordinary. How they ignored convention. Very different for me. It was, I was a bit rebellious. I had a child when I was quite young, but I didn't, I didn't risk anything like these women did.
And you already mentioned Karolina Schlegel, who's sort of at the heart of the book. Can you tell us a bit more about her? What made her so rebellious?
So I always try to. So I think the first thing to do is to introduce her with all her names, because that tells you already quite a bit. So she's Caroline Michaelis Böhmer Schlegel Schelling. So she has 4 names. One is the name of her father, and 3 are her husband's names. So she was born in 1763. She was the daughter of a very famous scholar in Göttingen. So she was highly educated, of course not at school, but through the kind of environment she lived in, with great access to books, for example. She spoke several languages fluently, and she was really fiercely independently minded. Already as a quite young kind of teenage girl, she kind of said, I don't want to ever get married. I don't want anyone like to tell me what to do. So, but then, like so many women at that time, she got married off quite young. But then she became a widow aged 24, which she was quite pleased about because she didn't particularly like her husband, and she really was very, very bored because he was a doctor in a small mining town in Germany, and it was not the intellectual stimulation she had been used to. And so then she but then she kind of hangs out with German revolutionaries, gets imprisoned by the Prussians for being a sympathizer with the French Revolution, and in prison discovers that she's pregnant after quite a wild kind of ball night. So basically one night, so she has a one-night stand with an 18-year-old French soldier. She's by then in her late 20s. She has to go to prison with her daughter, and eventually, just in time, kind of gets out of prison, and then has this child, gives it to foster parents, but is treated and called a revolutionary whore. So she then marries August Wilhelm Schlegel, who's a literary critic, who's utterly besotted by her, and she doesn't love him. But he gives her a new name, a new beginning, and they move to Jena. And it's a quite wonderful relationship, actually. Although she's not in love with him, but they really trust each other, and they really share this great love for the arts, for poetry and literature, and they begin to translate Shakespeare. And this Shakespeare edition is to this day the kind of the best and most accepted German Shakespeare translation. So it's the first German Shakespeare translation in verse, and they work together on it. I mean, they sit next to each other. We have descriptions, by friends who describe it, but you can also see it when you look at the manuscripts which are in Dresden in the archives. You can see both of their handwriting there. To this day, her name is not on the cover, of course. So she becomes very much the heart and soul and mind of this group in Jena. So she doesn't just create the physical space where they all meet, because we tend to very often describe these women, who ran these literary salons. They're just the muse of the man. It's not like this. So she really she's almost like a conductor. If they're an orchestra who her personality makes them kind of sing. And so she demands opinions. She really shapes the way they think. She's the one who makes them kind of political about the French Revolution. So she's incredibly important. And then eventually she falls in love with another philosopher who's there, Friedrich Schelling, and who's 12 years younger than she is, and who's also part of this group, a friend of her husband. And her husband doesn't really mind. In fact, Schelling is the one who then assists with all the, difficulties of getting a divorce. So Schelling is the one who then discusses this with Goethe, who goes to the Duke because you need permission to get divorced. So she gets divorced and eventually kind of marries Schelling. So that it's just a wonderful story, but it's also, I think, a reminder how even today there are so many women in the world who still don't have the right on education, political participation, and equality, and it's just, again, so for me history is not a kind of pile of dusty old ideas. It's something that can tell us something that is relevant for today.
I agree, and it's amazing really how these really strong and unique characters all come together, in not just in your book but in Jena, of course, at the time. I mean, she is one example, but there's really an amazing collection of people there in one place. You call these the Jena set, basically, so a group of thinkers, philosophers, most of them with amazingly radical ideas, some of which you've just hinted at with Caroline Schlegel. They don't just think like that, they also live like that, some of them anyway. And your book is, I think, really kind of marvelously effective at breaking down some of these really complex ideas, making them manageable for your readers, but also getting across just how modern and groundbreaking some of these things were. So maybe let's turn to one example, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who for me stands out because he's kind of his ideas are really in your title as well. Who was he, and why was he so influential, not just in Jena, but really for the way that we think today still?
Well, I think so. Basically, Fichte is a philosopher, and he comes to Jena in 1794, kind of really invited by Goethe. So Goethe is Germany's kind of great poet who lives in Weimar, who's the privy councillor of the Duke there, but who's also Germany's literary superstar when he publishes his book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, in the 1770s. And Fichte studied Immanuel Kant's work, and is very much influenced by it, and becomes like a Kantian. So and Goethe says this kind of great thing to the university. Basically says that, well, we can't afford Immanuel Kant. Let's take the young kind of Kantian before he becomes too famous, and then it's like in fashion. The more fashionable they become, the more expensive they are. So they kind of get him early enough. And he becomes a hugely popular professor. So he's a professor of philosophy there, and he has he's just a fabulous character because he's the opposite of what you think about kind of this kind of scholarly kind of maybe pale and feeble kind of philosopher. He's sturdily built. He's kind of really feared for his volatile temperament. He kind of stomps as he kind of like marches through his auditorium. He shouts. He eats his snuff tobacco rather than smoking it. So he's really quite a personality. He has a really, really loud voice. So, and you have half of Jena's students. So you have like more than 400 young men listening to these lectures. And what he does is he eventually kind of moves away from kind of Kant's philosophy and develops his own philosophy. And I think what's quite important is that he develops his philosophy in front of his students. So the students really have that feeling they can see how his ideas kind of come tumbling out of him. And he needs the students. It's almost like he kind of feeds on them, on their kind of like expecting kind of voices. Eyes. So he develops these ideas, and it's all about free will. So he, at a time when most of Europe is very much kind of, except of France, really held in the iron fist of absolutism, he gives us the most thrilling of all powers, free will and self-determination. So he says there are no absolute or God-given truth. He says everything kind of starts with the self. And he says the self posits its own being. So the self, he says, brings itself into existence, which for us might not sound very revolutionary, but at that time it really, really was. It is this idea that the self is the agent of everything. So if it posits itself, it also means it is the agent of everything. So the self is not ruled by God or by kings and queens, but by our own will. And that is so unbelievably thrilling and new that all the students kind of run to his lectures. Not just the students. You have Schiller and Goethe, the Humboldt brothers. Everybody's like sitting in these lecture halls to listen to what Fichte has to say, because it is so different and so new.
And I mean, it's quite amazing how many of these kind of radical and new thinkers really are in Jena at the time, with the kind of amount of brain power that is concentrated in this quite small place. So you already mentioned, the sort of literary giants that are Goethe and Schiller. You've got the Humboldt brothers. You've got philosophers like Schlegel there. So the obvious question, I suppose, is why did they all choose to hang out in Jena of all places?
I think it's a very particular situation. So I think first of all, it's why Germany, because of course Germany back then at the end of the 18th century is not a unified nation. It's this kind of colorful kind of patchwork of around 1,500 states, ranging from tiny principalities to these big, large, powerful states like Prussia and Austria. And what this fragmentation does, or one of the kind of positive flip sides of this, is that censorship is relatively difficult to enforce in a country like this. Basically, if your state doesn't allow the publication of your book, well, you just get it printed in another one. So it is a place where ideas travel quite easily. So Germans become this kind of nation of fanatical readers, because also unlike England or Spain, it's not a big empire. So the imagination is really fed on stories, on books. So there's a time at the end of the 18th century when more books are published in Germany than anywhere else, and literacy rates are soaring. So you have Prussia and Saxony standing at the absolute top worldwide in terms of like who can read. So you have almost every German town has a circulation library, like lending library, reading society. So books are incredibly important, and it's also called in Germany the age of paper. So that I think is very important. This is the kind of the broader context. And then in Jena, you have a very peculiar situation through kind of complicated inheritance laws. You have the University of Jena, which was once controlled by the Saxon dukes. Through these kind of inheritance laws, like Saxony gets kind of split in ever smaller little parcels. So by the end of the 18th century, Jena is ruled, or the University of Jena is kind of controlled by 4 different Saxon dukes, with no one really in charge or no one really caring that much. And it creates this kind of vacuum really for professors to do whatever they want. And then once you have so basically everybody who's in trouble with the authorities in their home states ends up in Jena. They get paid hardly anything. So, so the really famous professors don't really want to go there, the establishment, because they get paid more elsewhere. So you end up having these liberally minded philosophers who have troubles getting jobs elsewhere, and they all kind of gravitate there. And the most famous of all is Friedrich Schiller, who became famous through his revolutionary play The Robbers, and who is imprisoned in his home state for that. He ends up in Jena, and he is so famous that he becomes like a magnet for the younger generation. And then it's almost this kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. The more of those kind of liberally open-minded people you have, the more will arrive because they want to study under these minds.
Yeah, I remember there was a scene in the book where Carolina Schlegel was actually quite reluctant to go to Jena to start with, and then there's kind of the argument was, look at all the people who are already there. Imagine all the things you can do once you're there. I mean, you mentioned earlier, the sort of soap opera element of this whole thing as well. I love that about the book. It's full of historical gossip, for lack of a better word. So couples falling out with one another, who's having an affair with whom, whose egos were bruised by whose publication, that sort of thing. Were you surprised by the richness of personal detail that you were able to unearth from the documents, given that it's now quite a long time ago, really?
Yeah, I mean, I've never, ever had sources that were so personal. So Alexander von Humboldt, for example, I mean, he wrote 50,000 letters, he received 100,000 letters, but those are kind of mainly scientific letters. But this is a bunch of poets. So they write beautifully, that's one thing. I mean, each letter is just a little jewel in itself because, they just know how to write. But also because you have very strong women also in there, you get a very different idea of what's going on, because everybody has a different personality and writes differently. But it completely blew my mind how much like naughtiness happened there, because that was not something that I was taught at school in Germany. In Germany, like Goethe is this kind of god who sits on a pedestal and is aloof and writes the great dramas like Faust. But I did not know that, for example, he's like the most wonderful father. And he there are letters between him and his like his son, who's born out of wedlock, of course, because Goethe lives with his mistress for many years and the mother of his son. So you have, and I think this is where I am much more trained in the kind of the Anglo-Saxon way of doing history, the kind of warts and all. While in Germany, it's much more, you just look at the work. And this, I think, this kind of mad idea that we exist outside our personal lives. We are just these kind of brains who, produce work. So I think, and that is something that, we talked earlier about how it is as a German who writes kind of originally for the English market and then being published in Germany. It's kind of like a little bit of a mind twister sometimes. But I had, for example, one review which was critical in a big German newspaper saying she very much writes in the kind of Anglo-Saxon way of narrative history. One almost has the feeling one walks with these people through Jena.
It's terrible.
I think this is a compliment. Thank you very much. But it was not meant as a compliment because it's not something that is really, I think Germany is changing a bit now, slowly, but the German Sachbuch is very, very kind of academic. So for me, it was just this amazing kind of treasure trove of things that just don't get written about in Germany, but it's all there. And of course, all of these people are flawed personalities, and for me, that makes, that is the fun of it. They are not demigods. They are real people who, gossip and who backstab each other and sometimes are horrible. And, you read these letters and you think, oh my God, how can this person write this about that person? Because obviously they didn't know. I know because I read both of their letters, but they don't know what the other person is writing about them. So it was so much fun reading all these letters.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I certainly recognize what you say about, criticism in Germany for writing style that allows or kind of draws readers in. It's almost like it's perceived as cheating when you create emotions, such as humor or people kind of feeling for a person, having empathy for a person in your book. And for me, that's actually one of the big drawing points about writing in English is that you can tap into a tradition that other people have kind of already opened up there, where it's okay to write nonfiction in that way. Is that why you write in English rather than German, or are there other reasons?
I can't. So basically, I came to England when I was in my mid-20s, and there are a couple of things. One is, I think English is a writer's language. It's a language that is really based on adjectives and verbs. And German is very much a language that's based on nouns. It's a very precise language, so this was my first book where I really wrote about philosophy, and that was the first time where I suddenly thought like, oh, English is not helping me here, because there's some of these beautiful German compound words which just say something, which the English language doesn't. But in terms of describing how something feels and looks and landscapes, I think English is richer. So that was kind of for me almost like an epiphany, that I thought like, wow, this is a language that gives you so many more words. And I see that in the German translation. So I don't translate myself, but I get back a translated paragraph and it's the same verb 3 times. And I'm like, I am pretty sure, because I'm quite kind of particular about that, I'm pretty sure I did not use the same verb 3 times in one paragraph. And sure enough, there is no German equivalent for that. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing for me was reading narrative nonfiction here, which when I was in my mid-20s, did not exist in German, like whatsoever. And it was like reading a novel, but it was all true. And it just opened this kind of world where I thought like, I want to write books like this. This is fun. But I think also I was just born into the wrong language. I find English is, I don't know, I just love that. It's just such a beautiful language.
And are there any other outlets where you deploy that? So is there anywhere else that readers can look for your work? Say, I don't know, do you write articles or other books that you want to point people to?
Unlike you, I stick with the books. I don't know how you all do that. Maybe I'm just getting too old. No, I just, it's just the books. I mean, I do, when a book comes out, I will do a few articles, but I don't really, I do a lot of lectures because I absolutely love meeting my readers. I prefer that to writing articles because that's also when you read all the questions you get asked and you suddenly realize that this is what interests them in this book. And sometimes these are things that I didn't even pick up as I was writing it. So I love that. And also how different nations read. I mean, it's I have a very different audience in Germany to America, say, for example. So and then when that is done, I go back being a hermit and write the next
write the next one.
It takes so long. I take like 4 or 5 years to write a book because all my books are based on letters, but also in order to create the kind of the richness of you can walk with them through the streets of Jena. For that, you don't just read their letters, but also for Magnificent Rebels, I read lots of letters the students were writing home to their parents because they arrived in Jena and it was this new town, and they would kind of write to their parents saying like, this is what happened yesterday, and my professor is like this and this, and when in there, there was a drunken brawl in this tavern. So you get a sense of what the place is. So yeah, I am very much just the book writer.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I've sometimes compared it to method acting, when actors have to really get into character to understand what they're doing. As a historian, I feel I really want to get a sense of the people, the atmosphere, the kind of just the places you describe. And that does take time, and it does take a willingness to immerse yourself, I think, in the subject matter that maybe as an academic historian you would kind of deliberately step away from to keep that sort of distance. Well, just the last thing then on reception, because I found that really interesting with my books as well, that depending on who you speak to, especially internationally, people respond differently. Have you got an example for that, for Magnificent Rebels? So in what ways did the reception to it differ?
Magnificent Rebels, I mean, that's kind of the most obvious, is these names are all super famous in Germany. So this is the reaction is much more like, oh, I did not know this about Goethe. Oh my God, this is not what I learned at school. While in America, where they've heard of Goethe, sometimes of Schiller, but definitely not like the Schlegel brothers or Novalis or so. It was much more, or here in England, it was much more, look at these people, but they influenced Coleridge, Wordsworth, or the American Transcendentalists. So, you kind of zoom into a different aspect of this. But Humboldt for me was a great example also, where in Germany they can see him very much as a German. It's the German Alexander von Humboldt, and he really was a citizen of the world. And it was quite extraordinary to see how the other countries kind of embraced him much more as this kind of international scientist who's like connecting everyone. Well, in Germany they go like, "Oh, this is like Alexander. This is like our Alexander von Humboldt."
Yeah, brilliant. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for, Andrea. This, dear Zeitgeist listeners, was Andrea Wulf, author of Magnificent Rebels, a book I cannot recommend highly enough, not just because I love Jena, but because it is a brilliant book as well. So thank you so much for coming on the Zeitgeist podcast.
Thank you so much, too.
And if you've enjoyed this episode of the Zeitgeist podcast, check out the others as well. I've now covered quite a bit of ground, from German cars with James May to late justice for Nazi crimes with Tobias Buck. Do also have a look at my Zeitgeist blog on Substack. So long and auf Wiedersehen from London.